The Galactic Correctional Authority had run their prison for over 300 years, and in all that time, they had never met a species quite like humans. Most aliens who ended up in their cells either fought like wild animals or cowered in fear. Humans did neither, and this confused the alien guards more than they cared to admit. Lieutenant Jake Morrison had been flying a routine patrol near the outer rim when his ship's engines suddenly failed. What he didn't know was that the engine failure wasn't an accident. The aliens had been watching human military movements for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to capture one of their officers. They wanted to study human weaknesses, to understand what made this strange species tick. Jake's distress signal had barely left his communications array when the massive alien prison ship appeared beside his crippled vessel. The boarding was swift and efficient. Jake barely had time to send out a coded message before stun weapons dropped him to the deck of his own ship. When he woke up, Jake found himself in a sterile white room surrounded by creatures he had only seen in intelligence briefings. The Galactic Correctional Authority was made up of 5 different alien species, each more intimidating than the last. Warden Vextel belonged to the Zephyrian race, tall and thin with skin that looked like polished metal and 6 eyes that could track multiple targets at once. Another human, Vextel said, his voice carrying the metallic undertone common to his species. These creatures always surprise me. They look so fragile, yet they spread across the galaxy like some kind of virus. The other guards laughed, a sound that reminded Jake of grinding machinery. He had trained for capture scenarios, but nothing in his military preparation had covered being imprisoned by aliens who viewed humans as entertainment. "What do you want with me?" Jake asked, keeping his voice steady despite the circumstances. Vextel's 6 eyes focused on him with disturbing intensity. "Want? Oh, we don't want anything from you, human. You're going to provide us with something far more valuable than information. You're going to give us a show." The guards escorted Jake through corridors lined with cells containing the most dangerous criminals from across the galaxy. Some prisoners threw themselves against their barriers when they saw the guards pass. Others sat in complete silence, their eyes holding the kind of emptiness that comes from years of captivity. Jake tried to memorize the layout as they walked, noting guard positions and security measures. The prison was clearly designed to hold creatures far stronger and more dangerous than humans. The walls were made of some kind of energy-resistant material, and each cell had multiple layers of security. "You see," Vextel continued as they walked, "we have been studying your species for some time. Humans are weak physically compared to most galactic species. You have no natural weapons, no protective armor, and your lifespans are laughably short. Yet somehow, you have managed to establish colonies in over 50 star systems. This puzzles us." They stopped in front of a cell that was larger than the others. Through the transparent barrier, Jake could see movement in the shadows. Something large was pacing back and forth, occasionally letting out low growls that made the other prisoners in nearby cells go quiet. "Meet Thorak," Vextel said with obvious pride. "He is a Ravik, one of the most efficient predators in the known galaxy. His species hunts for sport, and they particularly enjoy hunting intelligent prey. Thorak here has killed 17 sentient beings from 12 different species." The creature in the cell moved closer to the barrier, and Jake got his first clear look at what the aliens had planned for him. Thorak stood nearly 9 feet tall, with muscles that rippled under dark fur. His claws were as long as Jake's fingers, and his teeth looked capable of crushing steel. But it was his eyes that caught Jake's attention. They weren't the mindless eyes of a beast. There was intelligence there, and something that looked almost like sadness. "The interesting thing about Thorak," Vextel continued, "is that he has been in solitary confinement for 3 years. We've been feeding him just enough to keep him alive, but never enough to satisfy his hunger. He's quite angry about his situation." Jake realized what was happening. This wasn't just imprisonment. This was a death sentence, disguised as an experiment. The aliens wanted to see how long a human could survive against a creature that was built for killing. "You can't be serious," Jake said, though he knew from their expressions that they were completely serious. "Oh, but we are," Vextal replied. "Consider this a scientific study. How long can a human survive when faced with a perfect predator? Will you run? Will you fight? Will you try to hide? We have made extensive wagers on the outcome." The guards activated the cell's opening mechanism, and Jake felt hands pushing him forward. The barrier disappeared, and he stumbled into the cell. Behind him, the barrier reactivated, trapping him inside with 9 feet of hungry predator. The assembled guards pressed against the viewing windows, their various alien faces showing expressions of anticipation. Some were already checking timing devices. Clearly expecting the show to be brief, Thorak emerged fully from the shadows, his yellow eyes fixed on Jake with the kind of focus that predators reserve for prey. The creature's breathing was heavy, and Jake could see the evidence of years of poor treatment in the way Thorak moved. This wasn't just a predator. This was a broken creature that had been driven to the edge of madness by captivity. Jake looked around the cell, noting its dimensions and features. There were no obvious weapons, no places to hide, and no apparent weaknesses in the barriers. The aliens had designed this to be a perfect killing ground. What the guards expected was panic. They expected Jake to scream, to beg, to try desperately to escape. What they got instead was something they had never seen before in all their years of running the prison. Jake Morrison, lieutenant in the human military, trained soldier, and decorated officer, sat down in the middle of the cell floor. He crossed his legs, placed his hands on his knees, and looked directly at the creature that was supposed to kill him. The silence that followed was so complete that the guards began to wonder if their viewing equipment had malfunctioned. The first hour passed in complete silence. Jake sat perfectly still while Thorak moved around the edges of the cell like a caged tiger. The alien guards pressed their faces against the viewing screens, confusion replacing their earlier excitement. This wasn't going according to plan. "Why isn't the human moving?" asked one of the younger guards, his voice carrying a hint of disappointment. Warden Vextal's 6 eyes narrowed as he watched the strange scene unfold. "Patience," he said, though his own confidence was beginning to waver. "Fear takes different forms in different species. Perhaps humans freeze when confronted with death, but Jake wasn't frozen by fear. His mind was working at full speed, processing everything he could observe about his situation. Years of military training had taught him that the first rule of survival was to understand your environment and your opponent. Panicking got you killed. Observation kept you alive. Thorak was magnificent and terrifying, but Jake forced himself to look beyond the obvious threat. The creature's movements told a story that the guards probably didn't even realize. Every step Thorak took favored his right side. There was a slight hitch in his breathing that suggested old rib injuries. His fur was patchy in places where it had been torn out and grown back incorrectly. Most telling of all were Thorak's eyes. Jake had seen that look before, in the faces of soldiers who had been prisoners of war for too long. It was the look of someone who had been pushed beyond their breaking point and then forced to keep going anyway. The second hour brought more pacing, but something had changed. Thorak's circles were getting tighter, bringing him closer to Jake with each pass. The guards leaned forward, finally sensing that the action was about to begin. Betting devices appeared as aliens placed wagers on how long the human would last. Once the violence started, Jake noticed the change too, but he didn't move. Instead, he began to speak in a low, calm voice that barely carried beyond the cell walls. "You know," Jake said, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead rather than looking directly at the predator, "I've been in worse spots than this. Hard to believe, but true. There was this time on Kepler 7 when my squad got trapped in a cave system for 6 days. No food, no water, and something hunting us in the dark." Thorak paused in his pacing, his head tilting slightly, as if trying to understand why his prey was making noise instead of running. Jake continued his quiet monologue. The thing about being trapped is that it changes you. Makes you do things you never thought you'd do. Makes you become something you never wanted to be. The creature resumed pacing, but his movements had become less aggressive and more curious. This was clearly not how these situations usually played out. By the third hour, the guards were openly complaining. Some had already left to check on other prisoners, bored by the lack of bloodshed. Warden Vextel remained at his position, but his patience was wearing thin. Perhaps the human is defective, suggested one of the remaining guards. Maybe we should introduce a stimulus to encourage more interesting behavior. But before Vextel could respond, Thorak finally made his move. The massive predator gathered himself and launched forward with incredible speed. Claws extended and jaws open wide. Jake's military reflexes kicked in. He rolled to the side just as Thorak's claws raked the air where his head had been a split second before. But instead of scrambling away or trying to find a weapon, Jake did something that stopped Thorak dead in his tracks. "Easy there, big guy," Jake said, in the same calm voice he had been using for the past 3 hours. "I know what it's like to be caged." Thorak landed awkwardly, clearly not expecting his prey to dodge so smoothly or to respond with words instead of screams. The predator spun around, ready for a second attack. But something in Jake's posture made him hesitate. Jake was sitting up now, but he hadn't moved away from Thorak's position. His hands were visible, showing he held no weapons. His voice remained steady and unthreatening. "They've been starving you, haven't they?" Jake continued. "Keeping you just hungry enough to be angry, but not strong enough to break free. I've seen what happens to soldiers when they get treated like that." Thorak's breathing was heavy from the exertion of his attack, but his yellow eyes were locked on Jake's face with an intensity that had nothing to do with hunting instincts. Slowly, deliberately, Jake reached into his jacket. The movement made Thorak tense, ready to strike again. But instead of pulling out a hidden weapon, Jake produced a small wrapped package. "Emergency rations," Jake explained, holding up the protein bar so Thorak could see it clearly. "Not much, but it's real food. Better than whatever garbage they've been feeding you." Without taking his eyes off the massive predator, Jake tossed the protein bar across the cell floor. It landed halfway between them, close enough for Thorak to reach, but far enough away that Jake couldn't grab it back. Thorak stared at the small package as if it might be some kind of trap. His nostrils flared, clearly detecting the scent of actual food, rather than the processed nutrient paste the guards had been providing. Jake settled back into his cross-legged position, making no move toward the protein bar or toward any possible escape route. "My name's Jake Morrison," he said quietly. "I'm guessing you've got a name too. They might have tried to make you forget it, but I'm betting you remember." For the first time since Jake had been thrown into the cell, Thorak stopped moving entirely. The great predator stood frozen, staring at this strange human who offered food instead of fear, conversation instead of screams. The guards watching through the viewing screens had no idea. They were witnessing something that would change the course of galactic history. They only knew that their entertainment wasn't going according to plan, and they were starting to get very worried about what that might mean. The first breakthrough came on the second day, when Thorak finally approached the protein bar Jake had tossed across the cell. The massive predator sniffed it carefully, his yellow eyes never leaving Jake's face. When Jake made no move to stop him or claim the food for himself, Thorak cautiously picked up the small package and ate it in 2 quick bites. Jake had been rationing his emergency supplies carefully, knowing they might be his only real food for days. But watching Thorak's reaction to actual nutrition instead of the slop the guards provided, he knew he had made the right choice. The predator's eyes showed something Jake hadn't expected to see: gratitude. "Better than prison food, right?" Jake said with a slight smile. Thorak tilted his head, clearly not understanding the words but picking up on the tone. It was the first time anyone had spoken to him like an equal in over 3 years. By the third day, they had developed a basic system of communication. Thorak would tap the floor once for yes, twice for no. Jake discovered that the creature understood more galactic standard than he could speak, which made sense for someone who had been imprisoned by aliens for years. "Your name," Jake said slowly, pointing to Thorak, and then to himself. "Jake, you." Thorak's response was a series of low growls and clicks that Jake's human vocal cords couldn't possibly reproduce. But buried in those sounds, Jake caught something that sounded like Thorak. "Thorak," Jake repeated, and the predator's entire posture changed. His ears perked up, and for the first time since Jake had been thrown into the cell, Thorak looked pleased rather than wary. What came next surprised even Jake. Thorak began to scratch symbols in the dust on the cell floor. Crude but unmistakably intelligent markings. Jake recognized some of them as Ravik hunting signs he had studied in military intelligence reports, but others were completely new. Jake responded by drawing his own symbols, star charts, tactical formations, and human mathematical concepts. The guards watching through the screens had no idea what they were seeing, but they knew it wasn't normal predator behavior. "What are they doing?" asked one of the younger guards during a shift change. Warden Vextel studied the viewing screens with growing concern. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I don't like it." The breakthrough in real communication came when Thorak managed to combine galactic standard words with his own gestures to tell Jake his full name. Thorak, the Bloodless. Once first hunter of the Corvani clans. The story that followed broke Jake's heart and fueled his growing anger at the same time. Thorak had been captured 3 years ago when alien forces invaded his homeworld. He had been defending a settlement of non-combatants when overwhelming numbers finally brought him down. Instead of killing him, they had decided he would be more valuable as a prisoner. They wanted to study Ravik combat techniques, Thorak explained, through a combination of broken standard and gestures. Made me fight other prisoners. Made me kill to eat. Jake understood now why the other prisoners went quiet when Thorak growled. It wasn't because they feared him as a natural predator. They feared him as someone who had been forced to become something he never wanted to be. "That's not who you are," Jake said firmly. "That's what they made you do to survive." Jake began, sharing stories of Earth, not the technical details that filled military reports, but the human stories that explained who his species really was. He told Thorak about the first humans who approached wild wolves with food and patience, turning predators into companions over generations. He described how humans had learned to work with horses, turning potential prey animals into partners. "My people don't just survive," Jake explained. "We make friends, even with creatures that could destroy us." Thorak listened to these stories with fascination. The concept of cooperation between species was not unknown to Ravix, but they had never encountered anything like humanity's approach to partnership. In return, Thorak began to share his own memories of home. He spoke of pack hunts where strategy mattered more than individual strength, of ceremonies where the strongest hunters would share their kills with the weakest members of the clan. The person Jake was getting to know bore no resemblance to the mindless killer the guards expected by the end of the first week. Their communication had evolved into something that amazed even Jake. Thorak was teaching him Ravik tactical concepts that were centuries ahead of human military thinking, while Jake shared human approaches to problem-solving that fascinated the former hunter. The guards grew increasingly nervous as they watched the two prisoners working together. What looked like simple scratches in the dirt were actually detailed maps of the prison layout. The gestures that seemed like casual conversation were tactical planning sessions. Jake had been memorizing guard rotations from the moment he arrived, but Thorak's enhanced hearing allowed him to track guard movements throughout the entire cell block. Together, they were building a complete picture of the prison's security systems. "Shift change happens every 8 hours," Jake whispered during one of their planning sessions. but there's a 15-minute gap when the new guards are getting briefed and the old ones are filing reports. Thorak nodded, adding his own observations through quiet clicks and gestures. Air recycling system runs maintenance cycle twice per day, loud enough to cover movement sounds. The most important discovery came when Thorak revealed that he had been studying the energy patterns of his cell barriers for 3 years. Weakness here, he indicated, pointing to a specific spot near the door mechanism. Power fluctuates during shift changes. Jake realized they weren't just planning an escape anymore. They were planning something that would shake the foundations of the entire Galactic Correctional Authority. Humans don't just survive, Jake whispered to Thorak during another shift change, his words barely audible over the sound of marching boots in the corridor. We adapt, and then we overcome. Thorak's yellow eyes gleamed with something the guards would have recognized if they had been paying closer attention. It wasn't the look of a mindless predator anymore. It was the look of a hunter who had found his pack. That the guards watching through the screens saw only a human and an alien sitting quietly together. They had no idea that they were looking at the beginning of a revolution that would spread throughout the galaxy. Started by the most unlikely partnership in interstellar history. Warden Vextel had been looking forward to this inspection all week. In his 3 centuries of running the prison, he had never seen a human survive more than 2 days with a hungry Revok. He expected to find scattered remains, and maybe some torn fabric from Jake's uniform. What he planned to do was document the scene, file his report, and use the data to prove once and for all that humans were the weakest species in the galaxy. The warden approached Cell Block 7 with 4 of his most trusted guards, each armed with neural disruptors and energy shields. Standard protocol required a full security detail when dealing with Revok cells, even when the occupant had supposedly been eliminated. Prepare the cleaning equipment, Vextel instructed, as they walked down the corridor. Revoks are messy eaters, and I want this cell ready for the next experiment by tomorrow. But when the viewing screen activated, Vextel stopped dead in his tracks. Jake Morrison was sitting cross-legged in the center of the cell, very much alive and apparently unharmed. Even more disturbing, Thorak was sitting beside him in what could only be described as a relaxed posture. "Scanner malfunction?" asked one of the guards, his voice uncertain. Vextel's 6 eyes focused on the scene with growing disbelief. The floor of the cell was covered with intricate markings that definitely hadn't been there a week ago. The markings looked deliberate, almost like some kind of communication system. "Run a full diagnostic on all monitoring equipment," Vextel ordered. "This has to be some kind of technical error." But the diagnostics came back clean. Every sensor confirmed what their eyes were telling them. The human was not only alive, but appeared to be completely calm. The Revok showed none of the agitation, typical of a hungry predator. Vextel activated the communication system to address the cell directly. "Human," he said, his metallic voice echoing through the chamber. "Explain your survival." Jake looked up at the viewing screen with what appeared to be mild amusement. "Survival," he replied. "I wouldn't call it survival, Warden. I'd call it making a new friend." The response sent a chill through every guard present. In over 300 years of operation, no prisoner had ever spoken to Warden Vextel with such casual confidence. "Impossible," Vextel hissed, his composure finally cracking. "The human should have been devoured days ago. Thorak hasn't been fed in over a week. He should have torn you apart within hours." Jake stood slowly, brushing dust from his uniform with movements that were far too calm for someone who should have been terrified. "Funny thing about humans, Warden. We make friends in the strangest places." As Jake spoke, Thorak rose to his full height beside him. But instead of the aggressive posture the guards expected, the massive predator moved with the fluid grace of someone working alongside a trusted partner. Vextel noticed something that made his blood run cold. Thorak's yellow eyes weren't fixed on Jake as potential prey. They were tracking every guard movement with the focused intensity of a hunter sizing up actual targets. "Something's wrong here," muttered one of the guards. "This isn't normal behavior for either species." Vextel made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his very short remaining life. "Open the cell," he ordered. "I want to examine this phenomenon directly." The other guards hesitated. Opening a Ravik cell was dangerous under the best circumstances. Opening one, when the occupant was displaying unusual behavior patterns, was potentially suicidal. "Sir," one of them said carefully, "perhaps we should maintain the barrier and conduct the examination remotely." But Vextel, as scientific curiosity, had overcome his caution. He had spent decades studying prisoner behavior, and this situation represented something completely unprecedented. "I said open the cell. That's a direct order." The energy barrier dissolved with its characteristic humming sound. Vextel stepped forward with 2 guards flanking him, while the other 2 remained at the entrance as backup. Standard protocol called for neural disruptors to be set to maximum stun, but Vextel wanted his subjects conscious for questioning. "Now then," Vextel said as he entered the cell, his 6 eyes scanning the markings on the floor. "I want to understand exactly how a primitive human managed to avoid becoming prey to one of the galaxy's most efficient predators." That's when Jake smiled, and Vextel realized he had made a terrible mistake. The attack came with perfect coordination that spoke of days of planning and practice. Jake moved toward the door controls with movements that were far too precise to be desperate improvisation. At the exact same moment, Thorak launched himself at the guards with strikes that had nothing to do with mindless hunger. Jake's military training became immediately apparent as he disabled the first guard's weapon with a technique that targeted the specific weak points in alien technology. His hands moved across the door control panel with the confidence of someone who had been studying the pre-system for days. Thorak's assault on the remaining guards was surgical in its precision. These weren't the wild attacks of a maddened beast. Every strike was calculated to disable rather than kill. Every movement designed to neutralize threats in the most efficient way possible. Warden Vextel found himself pressed against the cell wall, watching his elite security team being systematically dismantled by a partnership that shouldn't have been possible. The human was using techniques that combined Earth's military tactics with alien technology in ways that shouldn't have worked. The Ravik was fighting with a strategic intelligence that turned his natural predator abilities into something far more dangerous than simple animal aggression. "How?" Vextel gasped, as Jake secured the guards' weapons, and Thorak made sure they stayed down. Jake looked at the warden with eyes that held no fear, only a cold determination that made Vextel finally understand just how badly he had miscalculated. "You made one crucial mistake, Warden," Jake said, as alarms began blaring throughout the facility. "You assumed that putting 2 prisoners together would make them weaker. You never considered that it might make them stronger." Thorak moved to Jake's side, and Vextel saw something that would have been impossible just a week ago. The feared predator was taking tactical direction from the human. Their movements coordinated like members of the same military unit. Years of military training combined with Ravik's strength, Jake continued, checking the charge on a captured energy weapon, plus a week of planning and a very detailed map of your security systems. "You're right about one thing, though. This is unprecedented." The cell door sealed behind them as they stepped into the corridor, leaving Vextel and his unconscious guards trapped in the cage that was supposed to hold their prisoners. Through the energy barrier, the warden could only watch as a human and a Ravik began what would become the most successful prison break in galactic history. The revolution had begun, and it started with 2 prisoners who had discovered that their greatest strength lay not in their individual abilities, but in their willingness to trust each other completely. The escape from Cell Block 7 was just the beginning. As Jake and Thorak moved through the prison corridors, something extraordinary began to happen. Other prisoners, who had been watching the impossible partnership through their cell barriers, started calling out for help. The human freed the Ravik, whispered a crystalline prisoner whose species had been at war with the Ruviks for over 2 centuries. If they can work together, maybe there's hope for all of us. Jake realized they had a choice to make. They could focus on their own escape, or they could turn this into something much bigger. Looking at Thorak, he saw the same thought reflected in those intelligent yellow eyes. "We're not leaving anyone behind," Jake said firmly. "That's not how humans do things." What followed was unlike anything the prison had ever experienced. Jake's human tactical thinking combined with Thorak's knowledge of alien technology created a perfect storm of rebellion. They moved from cell block to cell block, freeing prisoners who had been enemies on the outside but now found themselves united by their shared captivity. The guards tried to respond, but they were facing something they had never trained for. Individual species were predictable. You knew how a Zephyrian would fight, what weaknesses a crystalline possessed, how to contain a Ravik. But when different species started working together, sharing their strengths and covering each other's weaknesses, the entire security system fell apart. A freed Zephyrian used their natural speed to scout ahead while a crystalline prisoner used their ability to interface directly with electronic systems to disable security doors. Ravik prisoners provided muscle while smaller, more agile species crawled through ventilation systems to attack guards from unexpected angles. Jake found himself in the strange position of being the coordinator for a multi-species rebellion. His human ability to think strategically and adapt quickly made him a natural leader, even though he was physically weaker than most of the aliens around him. "Sector 7 is clear," reported a freed prisoner whose species Jake didn't even recognize. "But we're getting heavy resistance near the command center." "That's where we need to be," Jake replied. "Thorak, can your people handle the main security station while my team takes the communication array?" The sight of different alien species taking orders from a human would have been shocking under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. These prisoners had watched Jake treat Thorak with respect and dignity, and they had seen the results. If a human could turn the prison's most feared predator into a loyal ally, maybe this strange species deserved their trust. The battle for the command center was intense, but brief. The prison guards were trained to handle individual threats, not coordinated assaults by multiple species working in perfect harmony. When Jake finally reached the main communication console, he sent out a signal that had been planned months in advance. "Commander Rebecca Hayes." Voice crackled through the commandeered communicator within minutes. "Lieutenant Morrison, this is Rescue Alpha. We're detecting massive energy signatures from your location. Please confirm your status." Jake smiled as he looked around the command center, now filled with freed prisoners from dozens of different worlds. "Roger that, Commander. Mission accomplished. The intel you needed on alien prison systems has been thoroughly gathered." The silence on the other end of the communication lasted several seconds. Then Commander Hayes' voice returned, filled with something that sounded like awe. "Jake, are you telling me you actually pulled this off?" "With help," Jake replied, looking at Thorak, who was working the alien control systems with surprising gentleness for someone with such massive claws. Turns out humans aren't the only species that values loyalty and teamwork. The truth began to spread through the remaining prison staff like wildfire. Jake Morrison hadn't been captured during a routine patrol. His engine failure had been carefully staged. The distress signal had been sent to specific coordinates. Everything had been planned down to the last detail. The Human Intelligence Service had spent 2 years preparing for this operation. They needed detailed information about alien prison systems, guard rotations, security protocols, and prisoner treatment procedures. But more importantly, they needed to understand how different alien species might react to human leadership in crisis situations. Jake had volunteered for what everyone knew was essentially a suicide mission. The plan had been for him to gather intelligence for as long as possible before his inevitable death. No one had expected him to survive, let alone succeed in liberating the entire facility. The Galactic Correctional Authority thought they were. Studying human weaknesses, Jake explained to the assembled prisoners as human rescue ships began docking with the station. Instead, they helped us discover our greatest strength. As the rescued prisoners began boarding the human vessels, something happened that would be remembered throughout galactic history. Thorak, the feared predator who had once been forced to kill for entertainment, approached Jake with the careful dignity of someone making an important declaration. The command center fell silent as Thorak placed one massive clawed hand on Jake's shoulder. In broken, but clear, galactic standard, he spoke words that would echo through diplomatic channels for generations to come. "Humans, not prey," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Humans, pack leaders." The other freed prisoners, representing dozens of species from across the galaxy, nodded their agreement. They had seen something unprecedented in this prison. They had watched a human turn enemies into allies, transform a place of despair into a beacon of hope, and prove that leadership wasn't about physical strength or technological superiority. As the evacuation continued, Jake stood in the command center that had once been the heart of an oppressive system. Around him, species that had been bitter enemies were helping each other board rescue ships, sharing supplies, and making plans to maintain contact after they returned to their home worlds. The Galactic Correctional Authority would never recover from this day. More importantly, they would never again make the mistake of underestimating humanity. Word would spread throughout alien space about the species that didn't just survive imprisonment, but turned their captor's own system against them. But for Jake, the real victory wasn't the successful intelligence operation or even the liberation of hundreds of prisoners. It was the sight of Thorak helping smaller prisoners board the rescue ships, using his strength to protect rather than to harm. Sometimes the greatest predator in the room isn't the one with the biggest claws or the strongest muscles. Sometimes it's the one who teaches others that they're stronger together than they ever could be alone. The rebellion that started in Cell Block 7 had become something much more important. It had become proof that the future of the galaxy belonged to those who understood that true strength comes from unity, and that the most powerful weapon in the universe is the willingness to see potential allies where others see only enemies.